Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Same with this, and this I thought would change. This is a story. This is a story. This breaks my heart, and I don't get it. I don't get it. I'm trying. I had a New Year's resolution to try not to be so quick to judge, in a silly way, people whose behaviours I don't understand. So this is going to sound very odd, given that we're having a conversation about life expectancy and the gap between England's richest and poorest neighbourhoods. But I joke with my children about adults on scooters. I always say there's two things that I would want you to take me to one side, girls, and tell me to sort myself out. The first is if I ever wear Crocs anywhere except by a swimming pool, and the second is if I ever suggest buying myself a scooter. And we joke about it. So I'm teaching my children in a very light-hearted way that adults on those scooters, not petrol-powered scooters, you know the ones I mean, the ball-bearing ones, yeah, and they increasingly see them. And I was coming into work today in my chauffeur-driven limousine, looking at people on scooters, tooling through Soho at full speed. And I had one of those moments where I sort of, oh, you wally. I nearly used an inappropriate word there. It's all the medication that I'm on. And, of course, if you were weighing up your financial situation and you were looking at accommodation versus travel costs, actually these scooters could play a role in your calculations, because you can shave your journey time by a factor of X, can't you? Because you see these people and they're going about 5, 6, 7 times faster than they would when they walk. So you could say, all right, well, I can afford to live in zone 2 or zone 3. If I scooter to work, I won't have to pay for a travel card every month. The travel card is a huge expense for an awful lot of people. Or even if do you see what I mean? So I try and see, why would somebody do that? And I sit there in my sort of arrogant, slightly sententious way sometimes and think, oh, you silly old sausages, what sort of an adult goes around on a scooter? Well, the answer's quite simple. The kind of adult who is doing things that I, at this stage in my life, am lucky enough not to have to do. Trading off my travel costs with my accommodation, with my location. So as I scoot past in my chauffeur-driven limousine, I will no longer sniff grown-ups on these kiddie scooters, because they are probably, in large part, not exclusively, some of them probably are a bit sad, but the massive majority of them, one hopes, are doing that as an economic calculation. And it's a useful reminder for people who are lucky enough to be comfortable, that even people who are ostensibly comfortable are still constantly calculating their outgoings, the Mr. Micawber, you know? And then you read stories like this, which we first touched on the programme 5 or 6 years ago, if you're kind enough to listen on a regular basis. And I know there's 3 or 4 times more people listening to the programme now than there were 5 or 6 years ago. But if you've been here for a long haul, you may remember the first time we did this, and you may remember my sort of spluttering incomprehension crossed with indignation, because it doesn't at first glance make sense that the affluence of the area in which you were born would have such a profound impact upon the length of your actual life. I'm going to say that again, because if you're not familiar with this story, if you haven't heard us discuss it in the past, it may strike you as the bleeding obvious, but I would argue that the more embedded you are in the middle class, the more shocked you will be by this. If you are born in the poorest neighbourhood, a boy born in one of the most affluent areas in England, we're talking specifically about England on this because that's where the research is, but the same will hold true in all the other parts of the United Kingdom. You take a boy born in one of the nation's most affluent areas, and you take another boy born in one of the poorest, and the former will live 8.4 years longer on average than the latter. And there are a heap of reasons for this, but to my rather naive eye, they're all addressable. They're all fixable, aren't they? You would have thought. And then you find yourself thinking, well, hang on a minute, you were mocking men on scooters 10 minutes ago. It's all very well you saying, why don't people go out and exercise more? Why don't they eat more healthily? You've got no idea what it's like to walk a mile or jog a mile or scoot a mile in somebody else's shoes. But what I don't understand, and what I think we'll focus on this hour, although as ever on the programme, you reserve the right to ring in and send us off in an entirely different direction. What I don't understand is why it's got worse since 2001. And I like that year on this, because you can't blame it all on David Cameron and austerity. In 2001, the gap between a boy born in one of England's most affluent areas would be 7.2 years. 17 years later, in 2018, it's gone up by over a year. It's 8.4 years. So in the course of the time that we have spent together, the time that we have been talking about stuff, trying to put the world to rights, we've actually been presiding over an increase in the life expectancy between people born in the poorest parts of our country and people born in the wealthiest parts of our country. And I don't really understand why. I understand that income inequality is going to impact on everything from diet to stress to exercise. But I don't understand why, as most of us would probably see this period in British history as being one of not unprecedented, but widespread comfort. Technology has freed us in ways that our parents could only dream of. Why would the gap have got bigger? Who's best qualified to answer this question? You'll forgive me for not inviting the authors of the report on. It's the Longevity Science Panel who've undertaken it. Because I've heard their answers before, and really I'm more interested, oddly, in the anecdote today than the data. Because some people listening to this programme will have spent time in both camps. You may have been born into a poor part of the country, but you have progressed from it, or vice versa. You may have suffered a little. You may have endured some privation. You may have had some knockbacks in life. We're often talking about how many of us would suffer if 2, 3, 4 paychecks away from the wheels beginning to rattle and possibly falling off completely. People who are on paper very well off, you know, they might be drawing down big incomes, but if the wheels came off tomorrow, they would not be able to sustain the lives they currently lead on anything like the scale that they're currently living. And if that's happened to you, perhaps you can explain why. I have a horrible suspicion that mental strength plays a much bigger part in life expectancy than we realise. So if you are, and I hesitate to do this because I don't think it's going to cheer anybody up, but if you're lying on your back and you've had a heart attack or a stroke or something like that, and there's a little bit of you inside that is going to fight to stay alive, there's another little bit of you that asks what you're fighting to stay alive for. And if your life is an uninterrupted avalanche of stress and fear and worry, I think, imagine why you might, and I hope this isn't irresponsible of me, I can imagine why you might actually roll over in a way that if you were financially comfortable, you were secure, you were comfortable, you were going off on holiday next year, you were surrounded by your loved ones, your children were happy, you had a roof over your head, your mortgage was paid off, you had cars, you had all sorts of other, what would we call them? What would we call them? They're not luxuries, are they? Unless you haven't got them. Because if you haven't got them, they're luxuries. To people who have got them, they are the fundamental foundation stones of a happy life. So I know that money doesn't buy you happiness, but my God, it buys you choices, buys you freedoms, buys you options, buys you space. And if you haven't got any space and you haven't got any options, is there anything you can do about it? 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. It's on paper kind of obvious why these things happen. Of course it is. But why has it got bigger since 2001? That's the question. Why has it got bigger since 2001? In the last 17 years, most of which we have spent in each other's company for 3 hours or 2 hours every morning. Why would it have got bigger since 2001? So from where you're sitting now, through the window nearest to you, you look out upon your area, wherever you are, whether you're in the north of Scotland or the depths of Devon, why would it have got worse in the 17 years that have unfolded since the beginning of this millennium? I don't know. I know why the gap exists. That's obviously too simplistic to waste our time analysing. But why has it got bigger in the last just shy of 2 decades? I'll take any answer you've got on that, because I haven't really got a clue. Except, of course, that the gap between the rich and the poor may be getting bigger, but most of the statistics suggest, oddly, that it isn't. Life expectancy rises are grinding to a halt. Rich and poor lifespan gap is widening. But the death rates for 60 to 89-year-olds have improved for all socio-economic groups. It's just that the most well-off have improved even more. Some of the things you might mention would include education. Why would education help you live longer? Just because you know how to be healthier? Crime? That's what I mean by fear. And that slightly grim picture I painted of just lying there, knowing that you have to sort of marshal your mental forces, you know, to fight something off, whether it be a heart attack or a stroke or even cancer, perhaps. Cancer survival rates are the highest they've ever been. And it involves mental strength. And if you aren't enjoying your life, I wonder if you fight quite as furiously to stay alive as you do when you are. It's 11:15. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. You can email james@lbc.co.uk. You can text, you can tweet at Mr. James OB. I didn't hear many female voices in the last hour, perhaps inevitably, given that we were talking about gun crime, but let's try and fix that in this hour. And then come 12 o'clock, we shall, if my voice holds up, and it's beginning to wobble, come 12 o'clock, we'll crack on with Mystery Hour. It's 11:16. And it is pretty shaming, actually. I sort of do find myself wondering sometimes. And in fact, as I mentioned to you in the last hour, we were talking in October of last year about Donald Trump's decision to lift Obama-era regulations on the ease with which people with diagnosed mental health problems can access guns. And the question I sometimes ask, I did it a lot last year, why aren't we more concerned about this? And really, in terms of national issues, the life expectancy gap, is it because none of us think that we're poor? And if we are, it's just temporary. That old Steinbeck line that I like to trot out at least 17 times a week. No such thing as millionaires in Depression-era America, just temporarily... No, I beg your pardon, no such thing as poverty, just temporarily frustrated millionaires. So I look at a story about life expectancy plummeting according to where you're born, where you live. And everybody caught on the wrong side of this fence thinks that they might just break through to the other side if the cards fall differently. I don't know. But what I really want you to tell me is why you think this gap is growing. Because it shouldn't be, according to most available measures. I've got phone lines free on this, and my apologies if you're waiting to talk about guns. As I said, with no facetiousness at all, we will no doubt be returning to that subject at some point in the not-too-distant future. But this is one that demands our attention. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Duncan's in Doncaster. Duncan, what would you like to say?
Couple of observations, James.
Yes.
One would be that if you're middle class and above, the availability of preventative medical situations is better. So BUPA, private health schemes, they're scanning people annually. So
are they, though? I mean, I don't know anyone who has... I'm 46, so I'm moving into that age. I don't know anyone who goes for a private health, and I've got some very wealthy friends. Maybe they just don't tell me. But I don't know that it would explain a nationwide...
No, I think it might be. So I do know people who go every year for an annual health checkup through their employer.
Right, okay.
So that's one observation.
It's another price of being self-employed, isn't it? Another flipping cost.
You and me both. The second observation...
should be at home in bed getting paid sick pay, but I'm here toiling away on your behalf, and you don't sound very grateful either, Duncan, if you don't mind me saying so.
I am very, very grateful indeed, James. The second bit is that I think that there's... if you don't... I mean, you touched on education. If you don't teach people how to cook for themselves and then not be able to provide a decent diet for their own children and those kind of things, I think there is a massive roll-up effect across generations, personally. And I think we've got, and of course the food industry's got very much into ramming everybody full of sugar.
Oh, that's the other big story today about processed food and cancer levels as well. But the problem is, the fly in the ointment of your theory is that the figures have gone up for all socio-economic groups. So the death rates have improved for the poorest people, but the gap has got bigger. That's the bit I'm struggling with.
Okay, you and me both. I just thought I'd tip in a couple of things anecdotally that are observations.
No, they're strong.
I really don't know. I said to the lady who took the call initially that I travel all over, and I've just left Doncaster, heading to York, and that it is very noticeable on the streets of Britain how the poorer areas look very much poorer nowadays.
It is, isn't it? I mean, I'll take your word for that, because you move around the country more than I do, but there does seem to be a sort of almost a 19th century flavour to the direction in which we're heading, where the dispossessed, and when you look at, I hesitate to do this because, of course, it's so repetitive now, and people who voted for it get so cross with me. But Brexit is going to hit the poorest parts of the country a hell of a lot harder than it is going to hit the wealthiest parts. And all the people that voted for it, all of the modelling shows, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse for them than it is for the metropolitan liberal elite.
Sadly, I think the people living there were almost the people who were convinced that it was going to be good for them and that they were deprived as a result of being in the EU, which was wholly wrong, of course, but there we are.
Aye, it's maybe too late. That ship has sailed. 24 minutes after 11. I find the notion of diet to be the most baffling one of all, to be honest with you, because we've talked about it a lot on this programme, and there is no reason why being born into a poor part of the country would somehow deprive you of the knowledge of diet. But it does, I guess, get filed under education. Duncan, thank you. And as you make your way from Doncaster to York, the life expectancy will actually be going up. Doncaster has some of the most poverty-stricken parts of Yorkshire, and York historically quite a wealthy city. I know that because, bizarrely, my first home was in Doncaster, and I went to school just outside York. Amina is in Halifax in Yorkshire. Amina, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'd just like to say I agree with the gentleman who just spoke about education and food. I remember having regular sort of home economic lessons where we looked at food, learned how to cook basic meals. I think I'm a GP, and I think food plays a large part in our health. Food and exercise. Now, if you look, there's a lot more traffic on the roads than there ever was. People, instead of walking to the shop...
No, I'm not going to argue with you, Doctor, except I am, actually. But that's not... I mean, you're more likely to be driving if you've got a few quid in the bank than you are if you haven't, so that can't be it.
Well, I think it's a case of most people will drive, but look at where they're living. The poorer areas are inner city, where it's not their cars, it's the traffic around them as well.
Oh, you mean they're breathing in unhealthy air?
They're breathing in, yes.
Sorry, and then if you...
I'm sure it's, what are the chances that in an inner city area you're going to go for a walk through Greenland trees every day?
Do you know, in Sheffield, which isn't far from where you are, the wealthier houses built upwind of the industrial infrastructure, weren't there? Sheffield Hallam, where Nick Clegg used to have his constituency, would be populated deliberately by people who could afford not to be breathing in the detritus and the exhaust from the steelwork. So again, what you're describing isn't new. I don't understand why from 2001 to 2018 it should have got worse.
The other thing that I thought might be part of this is if you look at how many takeaways are now popping up in inner city, poorer areas.
Yes.
2001, even if I look back, because I came from an area that was considered deprived, there were nowhere near as much takeaways as they are now. I think they've probably gone up about fivefold. Now, if somebody has the option of going to a takeaway, they're going, when they're coming home, they're feeling a bit tired. I know, I'll just get something. Can't be bothered to cook. That's what they're going to eat.
But, you know, historically, I would have thought, and this is again me, perhaps somewhat myopically looking at complicated issues through the lenses of my own simplistic experiences. I have more takeaways when I'm feeling flush than I do when I'm feeling skint. But this is me living in a bubble, right?
But you're living in an area where the takeaways might be expensive. Go down to a deprived area and you'll see, I've seen...
You get a kilo of chips and some unidentified...
And a drink for 99p.
Yeah.
So who cannot put their hand in their pocket and pull out 99p?
And the less time you've got on your hands.
If you bought the ingredients would cost.
When someone comes into your surgery, can you tell from their health? Can you get a handle on their wealth, their income bracket?
You can tell from when they speak to you.
Go on.
It's often with patients, there's a few things, the salt content and the sugar content. People who come from a more wealthier background generally tend to be in better health because they keep an eye on their weight. They can pay for gym membership even if they can't go for a walk.
So and exercise and diet.
A bit more conscious about what they're eating.
What about my slightly irresponsible speculations earlier about the will to live? In that you can lose the will to live. The more stressed you are, the more beleaguered your existence.
I don't know. Because in my experience, the will to live plays a huge role.
Yes.
But actually, you would expect people who come from a lower socioeconomic background to have a greater fight in them. See, I came from that background. I, against the odds, went to medical school. I came from a background where, we had very little money.
Yeah.
But in that sense, I was lucky because there weren't any takeaways around where we were. Even if there were, my mum used to cook everything from scratch.
And then we're back to the money, aren't we? So
what was going into it?
And she knew what was healthy. She knew what wasn't healthy.
Exactly.
And that, I mean, sometimes it's hard for people to grasp.
How much sugar was going in because she would be putting it in herself. She knew how much salt would go in there. But at the same time, when I on the ward, one of the things I noticed, and I noticed this, I used to work in a cancer unit.
Oh, yeah.
And you could, on your ward round, you could see the patients who would do well, not from their numbers, but from their attitude. Because the ones who wanted to get better, who were driven, did. And that's my experience. I was diagnosed with advanced cancer in my 30s, and I was told I had stomach cancer. I was told that they didn't know how long I had, but I was so determined to get better because I had young children. I had at the time a 3-year-old and a newborn.
Yeah, I mean, I salute you, but equally, it could have gone the other way. I don't want people listening to this who have been diagnosed to think that it's up to them whether they get better or not. There's a lot more in play, isn't there? You're in the lap of the gods a little.
Oh, what I'm saying is, people who have the attitude, the will, and it's a mindset. For me personally, I believe it's a mindset. It's not that you give up all the treatment, but along with the treatment, they're more likely to do the best for themselves than people who give up and think, well, there's no point in even trying.
Well, this is you are. I mean, you are alluding to what I fear, what I suggested, and doing it from the perspective of a GP, of a doctor, which makes it a lot more valuable than my pontifications. And oddly, I'd say the same about Andreas, who's been in touch. He's a pal of mine who's a greengrocer, and he's bent my ear on several occasions about the decades in this country, different from other European countries that have seen the supermarket industry, largely unregulated, convincing us that we're time poor and that processed food is the answer to our problems. All sorts of things get filed under that, a multitude of sins. And the other story, the other health-related story in the news today that we would have looked at probably if it wasn't for this one, is the link, the apparent link, although there's a correlation, not necessarily a causation, between heavily processed food and cancer levels. So the more cakes, crisps, pizza and chicken nuggets you eat, arguably, the more likely you are to sustain cancer. Of course, it could be the more likely you are to get obese, and the more obese you are, the more likely you are to get poorly. But there's clearly something worth examining. Amina, thank you. We're just looking not so much at the gap between life expectancy according to the affluence of the area in which you live, because I think there are dots that can be joined together quite straightforwardly on that. But why it has got worse over the course of the last 2 decades, a period of British history that, certainly in terms of technological advances, you could argue has seen people free to pursue slightly healthier lifestyles. And by technology, I don't just mean the fact that you can cut an awful lot of time out of your life by using technology. I also mean medical advances. So why since 2001 should the life expectancy of someone born in one of England's most affluent areas have increased by over a year compared to someone born in one of the poorest? And what I really want is people who perhaps have lived it, who have seen life on both sides of the track, because I make no bones about the fact that I haven't. Thank the Lord. It's a blessing. It's luck. It's an accident of birth, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know what it would be like to be living in one of the poorest areas in the country. I also know that the generalisations won't be absolute. There'll be people living in areas of widespread poverty who are managing to pursue healthy lifestyles. And I want to know what they're doing right that everyone else is doing wrong. David is in Bolton. David, what would you like to say?
Well, you touched on it before, but you kind of mentioned you were curious why it was the life expectancy for the poor was going up when... Yes. But that is because of medical advances. I'm fairly certain of that. So
cancer survival rates are at an all-time high, which means that the death rates will have diminished, regardless of your income.
Yes, but at the same time, because income equality has fallen and job security has fallen, all those factors that are pushing the life expectancy down of the poorest people are going to continue.
Why would job security impact upon your life expectancy?
I think that one would come down to stress.
Do you?
I think, I can't be certain of this one, but I'm sure I've seen studies saying that stress has a big impact on life expectancy, the efficacy of treatments, and if you're in a situation of increased stress, then your health is going to be affected. Of course, your finances are going to be affected, which...
There's different flavours of stress, isn't there? Because, you know, I got mates in the city or what have you who put in the 16, 17 hours a day, and they think, not so much now, but when they were younger, they think they're masters of the universe, and they would argue that they lead incredibly stressed lives. But there's a massive difference between wondering how many noughts there are going to be on the end of your bonus at the end of the year and wondering how you're going to eat at the end of the month.
Yeah, the difference between 0 and £600 a month is a hell of a lot bigger than the difference between £600 a month and £1 million a month.
Gosh, I suppose it is in a way, actually. Yes. I mean, you chuckle because you think that's a statement of the obvious, and I double-check the numbers, perhaps, but the central principle is sound, isn't it? Is the prospect of having nothing, I think, is the one that a lot of us miss, politicians in particular, let alone journalists. That statistic last year of 17 million people who wouldn't be able to get their hands on £100 in the case of an emergency, kind of answers some of the questions we've been asking this hour, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm incredibly lucky in that I grew up in an area that was very deprived, but my parents worked very hard to ensure that I was always in the case. I was never in the situation I couldn't let myself get a hold of £100, and with friends who couldn't, the difference is intensely profound.
Describe it to me if you can. Sorry, you're about to.
So yes, so there's a simple situation where, I think one of my friends got a tooth chipped, and he was on much better wages than I was at the time, but he couldn't get it replaced, couldn't get it fixed, because he wasn't able to get hold of the money.
Yeah.
And
whereas you could have phoned mum and dad.
Yeah. Well, they gave me 6 months' rent to get started up, and I just made sure that I didn't dip into my savings unless it was an emergency.
So you always had a safety net, and your mate who was earning more didn't have a safety net for something as relatively banal. So there'll be people listening to this who struggle to believe that a chipped tooth could have a profound impact upon any aspect of your life. But if you ain't got the money, you ain't got the money.
Yeah, it's just there forever. It took him years to fix it, and so I mean, it's not hugely profound, but you know, there's always that thing of having a temporary attachment, and any time that just something comes up where you need to get your car fixed, then you're going to debt, and the cost of that can be very significant. like interest rates are particularly high, so you can just end up paying them for years. We're seeing what's going on with payday loans.
Yeah, you're right. And there's a brilliant Tom Wolfe novel called A Man in Full that's just been echoing in the back of my mind while you were talking, which details the experiences of a man it was a parking fine that ruined everything. His whole life unravelled because he parked legally. Someone else came along and nudged him over the edge of the bay. His car got towed. He had to get his car back. He was at a job interview. He'd been on his uppers for a while. It sounds a little odd, but if you had money in the bank, none of that would matter. If you haven't got enough money to get your car that you need to do the job you've just secured after a few weeks or months of being unemployed, you can't. I don't know that you can ever imagine that. I think you have to live it, or you just don't know. David, thank you. Mystery Hour on the way from 12. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I would argue, just to be political for a moment rather than simply economic, I would argue that there's been is calcification a word? I don't think it is, but there is, if you look at the tabloid newspapers, since the Sun replaced the Mirror as the working class newspaper of note, there is a rush to judgment. There is an idea that poverty is shameful and your own fault, as opposed to the kind of Hugh Cudlip era Daily Mirror, which taught self-improvement and aspiration. I'm being a little bit simplistic, but also historically accurate, so that now you are less likely, perhaps, to seek to improve your circumstances than you would have been in the 50s. But why the last 17 years should have seen an increase on this front, I do not know. Going to catch up after the break with developments in Northern Ireland, where you'll have learnt, of course, that the devolved power sharing appears to have hit the buffers. A remarkable state of affairs, really. Any other period that wasn't Brexit dominated, the idea of Theresa May's majority being dependent upon the DUP, and the DUP essentially banjaxing the power sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland would be huge. But obviously these are uncharted waters that we find ourselves in. It's 11:45. We used to have framed at home the front page of the Telegraph from when Dad was on it, with there were two O'Briens and an O'Neill on the front page, and some, because the Telegraph historically was very unionist, very pro-union, and somebody took grave offence at this and thought that it was evidence that the Catholics were somehow taking over the newspaper of note, and they sent some hate mail to the Telegraph's office in Birmingham that my dad was in charge of, and Dad, I don't know where I get it from, Dad framed it, put it up in the downstairs loo at home, and it echoed a bit this morning when I saw the front page. Essentially, I think you read it as the DUP having hung Theresa May out to dry on the issue of devolved power, calling for direct rule to be introduced once again from Westminster. But I think better late than never is probably the wisest way to describe the attention that we're now paying to Irish politics. If we'd paid a little bit of attention to Irish politics before the Brexit referendum, it would have perhaps been less of a shock to anybody who didn't listen to this programme in the immediate aftermath to see what an enormous role that border is going to play. And it means that eyes are drawn to Northern Ireland in a way that they haven't been since the Troubles. And that's why I'm drawing your eyes there now with the help of one of the finest political reporters in the region, Peter Gagan. He's the editor of Political Insight, and he joins me on the line now. It's kind of hard, forgive me, Peter, on this side of the sea, to imagine or to understand why an insistence from Sinn Féin upon the Irish language being properly recognised in the north of the island should have the power or the ability to scupper the entire devolution process. But that's certainly how it looks this morning.
Yeah, I think this is really one of these issues that...
Just got to sort your phone line out, Peter. I don't know if you've I don't know if you've done something with your phone in the interim since you spoke to the producer, but we'll just try and sort that out before we put you back on air. Can we do that? No? Well, we'll try and fix that. I'll have a quick word with... Shall I have a quick... No, I'll try Peter again. Sorry, Peter, over to you.
James, have you got me now?
That's much better, Peter. Come on.
Oh, excellent. I don't know what's happened there.
That's grand.
Well, in terms of the Irish Language Act, I think for a lot of people, even within Northern Ireland, they are struggling to understand why this has become such a systemic thing. And the reason is because, like a lot of things in politics, it's not really about the Irish Language Act. The Irish language became this kind of issue that kind of wrapped within it are lots of other kind of problems between unionism, political unionism and nationalism, which is within Sinn Féin and DUP. And if you wind back to about a year ago when the Stormont Assembly collapsed...
Just get your phone out of your chin, man. Because seriously, it's gone again. I don't know if you've got your phone pushed into your chin or something. It was brilliant for about 30 seconds, and I need to hear you. There you go, you're back now. It's your pearls of wisdom that we want, Peter. That's better.
Sorry about this, James.
That's great. That's much better.
So basically what it was, about a year ago when it collapsed, when the Stormont Assembly collapsed, it was over the renewable heating initiative.
I can't, mate. I'm so sorry. I don't know. It's not your fault. There must be something with the line, but if I can't understand what you're saying, and I've got industrial strength earphones on my bonds, then the people listening out of their transistors at home or in their cars definitely won't be able to. We'll try and fix that before 12. After 12, of course, it's mystery hour. Before that, we'll have another crack at the question of income equality and life expectancy. It's heartbreaking. It really is heartbreaking. Unless, of course, you haven't got much of a heart, in which case, presumably, you don't care. Katie's in Truro. Katie, what do you think's going on here?
There does seem to be a really strong development of the attitude that if you aren't already born with a little bit of a cushion, as your previous caller talked about, that everybody should be able to crawl their way out of a hole that society has built for them. And increasingly over the last few years, that's not the case, and we know that's not the case. There's something that we learn about in healthcare, because I'm a nurse, called, and it's 101 healthcare, which is the thing you do on kind of day 2, and it's called an understanding of the social determinants of health. And that the context in which we live and the way we live and the people that we surround ourselves with and our attitudes to our health have a direct impact, and that affects everybody across every income level.
Yes. So
that when we assess people's needs in healthcare and in nursing, we complete a holistic evaluation, biopsychosocial evaluation, because how people live and the context they find themselves in, through their own fault or not, will impact on every aspect of their health and well-being. And for some reason that I struggle to understand, as somebody on the ground seeing it on a daily basis,
yes,
recent governments have chosen to remove that context and that understanding and that science-based policy from decisions that they're making. So we see public health funding, for example, being slashed to record low levels. And
what do they expect to happen?
Well, yeah.
Yes.
And so we're, as healthcare professionals, we do an awful lot of patching up.
I wonder if this is where the politics do come into it. When I suggest that people have been encouraged to see poverty as a failure, as we blame it now on the people who are caught up in it, even when we learn the truth about we learn the truth about 0-hour contracts. We have that narrative of striver versus skiver. So if you're skint, it's your fault, and that allows politicians to make an already bad situation worse.
Yes, it justifies decisions that they make. And I can't possibly make a judgment about what the government agendas are, but the outcome of their decisions are incomprehensible to those of us who know the facts and the science about how social context impacts on health. Poor people die of different things to rich people.
They do, yes. But they shouldn't, should they?
It would well, in theory, no, they shouldn't, but they die of different things, and they have very different experiences of health and health treatment and health care as well.
But there's no votes in it, because if you've managed to demonise the people that are suffering, and in many ways encouraging them, as Brexit has taught us, to often vote against their own best interests, then why would you put any effort at all into trying to encourage them to vote or to change their politics according to self-improvement? I'm cracking on, Katie. I'm sorry. I could have talked to you more, and I will next time, I promise. But we're going to have another go with Peter Gagan, who is the political reporter in Northern Ireland, editor of Political Insight, and it's his third time lucky on this one. So, briefly, Peter, what's going on, and what does it mean for the broader picture of the province?
Well, basically, we're not going to have an agreement anytime soon. What was really striking yesterday, I think, was that it looked as if it was possible to have an agreement. We know from behind the scenes, Sinn Féin and the DUP were coming closer together. But I think Theresa May's visit really kind of scuppered a deal, and the kind of media attention on an agreement because of this Irish Language Act, which is very, very, which a lot of grassroots DUP people are against.
Right.
And realistically, we're not going to have any devolved government in Northern Ireland anytime soon.
And that means a return to direct rule for the first time since, 2007. So, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement's coming under stress from Brexit. Now it's coming under stress from this as well.
Well, in some ways, the two things are very much linked. You know, what you're seeing with the DUP is, historically, the DUP's Westminster Brigade weren't very influential. They just sat on the backbench of Westminster. They weren't very important. What we're seeing now is the DUP's Westminster contingent hold the string, are very influential, obviously, in keeping Theresa May in power, and are increasingly influential in Northern Ireland too. And I think the Brexit process means that we're unlikely to see any kind of resolution anytime soon, and it kind of the DUP's power and a more hardline part of the DUP are far more powerful than they were before.
So I'm slightly surprised by the bleakness of your outlook. You think this is pretty much game over for the foreseeable then?
I think it's very difficult to see how the two sides can come back anytime soon because of the nature in which this was rejected so quickly out of hand. There's been weeks of talks going on in Stormont between the DUP and Sinn Féin. There was a sense behind the scenes that things were moving. The Irish language was a sticking point, but there'd been a kind of a fudge around this kind of a new piece of legislation to respect other languages, including Ulster Scots. And I think the speed at which it broke down is really very worrying, especially considering the kind of publicity that was coming out beforehand. In Northern Ireland, there is a history of brinksmanship, of talks going to the last moment. But in this instance, it seems to be difficult to see where some sort of compromise can be brought back, given how strong the kind of the rejection of it was from the DUP and what Arlene Foster has said since. So it does look very difficult. And the Brexit is just putting pressure upon pressure, really, on the Northern Ireland situation. Relations between DUP and Sinn Féin have not been good for a long time. They weren't good in the run-up, even in the run-up to the Brexit vote, and they've got a lot worse since. But the whole issue of Ireland and the Irish border is really going to intensify the pressure in Northern Ireland, because you have the DUP being pro-Brexit, you have the DUP, particularly the Westminster contingent, being very pro-Brexit, and they're supporting Theresa May. And at the same time, you Sinn Féin and Irish nationalism, and Dublin as well, been very anti-Brexit and very worried about what it means for the border. And you can see the two sides. It's very hard to see a compromise. And the Irish language, it's in some ways it's just become a kind of symbol of this lack of compromise, and I think it's also very difficult for the DUP to turn around and do a deal.
It's also a symbol, perhaps, of mutual respect, isn't it? From the Sinn Féin's point of view, it would be the way that shows the nationalist or the Irish identity has the same weight in Stormont as the unionist identity.
And I think that is part of it. And one of the reasons Sinn Féin pulled out of government just over a year ago, it was facilitated by this RHI scandal, this heating scheme that cost far too much money. But really part of it was, for a lot of nationalists, there was a sense that they weren't getting respect. They weren't getting things that they'd expected, they'd hoped to get. The language from the DUP remained very, very hardline, even though they're in government together with Sinn Féin. And it's going to be very difficult, nigh on impossible, for Sinn Féin to go back into government without this sort of an act. Without some sense. I think respect kind of goes to the heart of it. And it's very worrying 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement that there isn't what we call parity of esteem. There isn't a kind of strong sense of respect across the communities.
Peter, it was worth the wait. My apologies for the complications in getting you to air. I'm glad that we did. We'll talk again, because I suspect that focus upon this corner of the United Kingdom is only going to grow in the coming months.